So I initially thought that this was going to be a pretty straightforward and simple video, and I would only have 2 games to talk about, but of course I should have known better. Back in October of last year, I uploaded a video about a game called The Cube Save Us. It was an Unreal Engine Battle Royale game that takes place on a cube. I don't remember if it was from outer space or it just had some weird powers. It was some sort of magical sci-fi sort of deal. It was an extraction shooter with emphasis on like melee, and there was some sort of like zombies going on. I don't really remember, but what I do remember is that it was very quick to ask you for your credit card information and very slow to give you a reason to keep the game installed. It also had some performance issues and just looked like a general asset flip. Well, they've recently announced that the game is now shutting down. It's almost like I called it back in October, but what can I say? Then, and this one hurts a little bit more, comes Dungeon Stalkers. Dungeon Stalkers was a game that I was actually pretty positive about. It was a third-person character extraction dungeon crawler, very similar to Dark and Darker, or jeez, there's so many of these coming out now that I can't keep track of them all. This one sucks because it did scratch the dungeon crawling itch. Solos, duos, or up to teams of 3 would go into a dungeon, and they would fight with monsters inside of that dungeon or with other players that are doing the same thing. It had satisfying loot and a unique mechanic that was centered around clothing, which basically functioned as armor over your health. But on top of just that, there was a mechanic where every so often a witch would cast a spell over everyone in the dungeon, and that would either hurt or help you, depending on the effects, which is randomized. And these effects would be in place regardless of if you were fighting NPC monsters or players. Both of these games had an issue where the developers did that thing where they would pretend to care about player feedback and then completely and totally ignore it. Dungeon Stalkers was a little bit less quick to ask you for credit card information, but when you did finally look at what they were offering for sale, you realized that things were very, very, very expensive. And it just wasn't really worth the price that they were asking for. Not to mention the fact that players, pretty much ever since the game was initially released, were talking about wanting a PvP exclusive, or a PvE exclusive mode, and the devs just flatly refused that. What I find particularly interesting about both of these games, though, is that they all sponsored streamers to play them. Normally, that's not really a problem, but I began to notice a trend where streamers would be sponsored to play a game, they would play it exactly one time, and then they would never touch it ever again. On top of it just being low quality and asset flippy and just kind of scummy, not overly scummy to the point where it's like the day before or whatever that game was called, but to the point where you're just like, I don't actually know. You think that they're up to something, but you can't really tell for sure. The game is there and it is playable, but there's some shady business practices going on in the background with both of these games. This game has also been announced that it is shutting down. And I find that unfortunate because if they had actually listened to player feedback, then this game could have been a lot more than what it ended up being. Because another game is also closing down its servers soon, and that is Let It Die. Now, I've talked about Let It Die many times on this channel. I've played it a lot. I have hours and hours and hours. I have over 100 hours in the PC version, but I also played it on PlayStation 4. I played a lot of Let It Die. And also, Let It Die is the most successful game that this particular team has ever made. It kept its player base. Even when they tried to do things like Deathverse and Let It Die Inferno, which are all games that are Deathverse is dead, and Inferno, I can't find any information on anybody who actively plays that game. So I assume that it is next on the chopping block. But what also makes Let It Die so strange is with the announcement that the online services are shutting down, they also say that an offline version will be available to play in fall of this year. So they know that this game is something that people still want to engage with and play. And I'm glad that they had the foresight to create this offline version that isn't server dependent. But again, people were saying that they wanted Let It Die, except to play it with their friends going up the tower. And again, that never happened. So my takeaway from all of this is that when it comes to live service games, the issue isn't just the fact that it's a server-dependent thing, and once you reach a point where you can't fill lobbies, the game is basically doomed to fail. It's a combination of stubborn developers that refuse to actually take the big complaints that players will have into consideration, as well as a monetization model that is just completely unfriendly to players. All of the games that I've talked about in this video so far have had people complain about pay to win, greedy monetization, gacha systems, all of that stuff. It just reeks of greed, and it discourages new people from ever giving the game a chance to begin with, even if the game has potential or is fun. Now, with that being said, I may as well go ahead and talk about games that I think are coming up next. The first obvious one, aside from Let It Die Inferno, which I don't think really can come back from its dying state, is probably Sin Duality. That is the mecha extraction shooter that is based off of the anime Sin Duality. I played it and had a lot of fun with it, of course, but again, the fact that the developers are not listening to player feedback, they have big issues with new players being put in situations where they have absolutely no chance, no ability to play with friends unless it's accidental, just makes it a complete miss on their part. And while the servers are still up, you just get the feeling that there's nothing that they can do at this point to turn things around for the game itself. The good news with that one is that it seems like it will follow Let It Die in its path of having some form of playable game once those servers do go down, which was announced and talked about before the game's release. So at least there's something for that. Other than Sin Duality, I think that Mecha Break is another game that has got very, very little time left for it. Mecha Break is just a PvP mecha game. It's got fast-paced action. It too has complaints about its monetization and not listening to player feedback. I bring up Mecha Break because recently I've been seeing a bunch of people talk about it. Not in the sense that the game is trying to make a comeback or that the game is about to be shut down, but the fact that there is just a few dedicated developers that are still there working on the game and haven't moved on to new projects. And they're determined to see the game see some sort of success. So they're doing a big call to action for content creators and players of the game to try and spread the word of it. And the whole thing to me just reeks of desperation. In my opinion, if they had been doing what they were supposed to from the moment they launched the game, then it would have never gotten to this point in the first place. So it really seems like now that the curtain is starting to fall, they're like, oh no, we have to do something. And a lot of times, most times in fact, it's too little too late for that. So, if you play any of these games, let me know what you think down in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.